Good morning and welcome back. My name is Ken Salle, and I will be reading for you today from The Day We Said Goodbye, a meditation on acceptance. And before I begin, I want to let you know that I just got back from my morning walk. I haven't had breakfast, which is kind of usual for me. I'm not drinking coffee this morning. I'm actually drinking Diet Coke. Sadly, no product placement, which is not opportune because today's chapter is not going to be an easy chapter to read. As a writer, my editing skills have improved to a point where this very long chapter, which I'm going to divide into two parts, two videos, it would have been cut down to a page. But there were things that I found much more worthwhile writing about back then in 2010 or so. When was this published? 2014, wow. I was a lot more interested in writing about that 6 years ago than apparently I am now. And one of those topics, of course, being my ex-wife. There's a lot about her in this chapter, and I would rather not read it. But the guy who wrote this book felt it really important to be in there. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the text in the book, but I reserve right to comment on anything in here because there will be a lot worth commenting on. So today we're reading Chapter 4, Part 1. There was also a wedding to plan. Summer 2005. There was one thing that was always easy, and that was loving Vicky. Neither of us wanted our first date to end. We set our wedding date in just a few weeks. After just a couple of months, I formally proposed marriage. Together, we laid out our lives before us. Or at least that's the way it seemed to me. On Memorial Day weekend, 2005, Vicky and I decided to lay some ghosts to rest and put the past behind us. Vicky took me to the scene of my near suicide at the Grand Canyon for some well-deserved, well-needed healing. She even had a picnic waiting for me. And we ate it beneath expansive pines, my eyes eating her up. Vicky was beautiful, smart, funny, and she liked me, which I never could explain, but was smart enough not to question. After our picnic, we had to get back on the road again and drive out to Phoenix. We had plans to see my dad and Blanche the next day. Rather than take the same route, or rather than take the safe route, right now my eyes are so blurry because I'm so tired because I hardly slept last night. Fun. Rather than take the safe route, we did what we so often do. We went out and got ourselves lost. There's nothing better than being lost with Vicky. I can't really explain it. The romantic in me is tempted to say that whenever I'm with her, I'm home. And I still agree with that. On the road to Flagstaff, we spotted a huge storm up ahead, but we didn't care. I told Vicky it reminded me of the monster, the huge storm that had stopped me from killing myself just a few years before. I had no idea where it was going or if we would drive into it, and I really didn't care. I told Vicky about how I loved doing things by dead reckoning, writing, acting, even falling in love. Vicky asked me if I thought our love was guided by dead reckoning, and I couldn't agree strongly enough. How do you think I knew to propose 2 months after we met? I asked her. I'd been burned so many times before, but there was no doubt in my mind that you were the one. The world around us was new and lovely. Yes, even Arizona. By the time we hit Phoenix, the hour was growing pretty late. We checked into the first hotel we could find, and Vicky and I went to bed, ready for an early start the next day. After a while, I could hear Vicky's sleeping sounds. I could hear Vicky's sleeping sounds beside me, and I was wide awake. I decided to head out for a walk, which is what I often do when I can't sleep. The midnight The midnight Arizonan air was hot enough so I could walk in shorts and a t-shirt as if it was the middle of the day. I decided I wanted a pack of smokes, but there wasn't a liquor store or gas station for miles. I knew that because, as it turned out, that's how far I walked. I came back to the hotel reeking of cigarette smoke and fairly exhausted by almost 4 a.m. But sleep, I could tell, was still some distance away. I didn't head up to the hotel room. I sat on the grass embankment around the back of the hotel and smoked and thought about this and that until the sun began to peek reddishly over the horizon. Then I returned to the room, showered, and went back to bed in time for Vicky to wake up. This wouldn't be the first time Vicky met my dad or Blanche. They had met at our home in Anaheim a few months before. I remember sitting Vicky down that day and warning her, "Listen, I don't want you to be nervous, but I don't want your expectations to be too high. My dad and Blanche loved Rosa. They were very close." Rosa was my first wife. You may have heard me mention her a time or two. She and I were together for 12 years, and losing her was something of a shock, like an engine block falling on a hamster. My life with Rosa was filled with all sorts of stories, the kind you just know would be great to share with your kids one day. Our first Thanksgiving together, Rosa had purchased some Pyrex knockoff dishes from someone selling door to door at her office. She had been told she could cook in them just as if they were Pyrex. We had wanted a traditional dinner, and our oven was filled with glass dishes cooking stuffing and potatoes and 3-bean casserole. The time came to take all of those dishes out. Rosa opened the oven door, and just as the cold November air, or cool November air conditioning, because after all this was Southern California, hit those Pyrex knockoffs, they exploded. They popped like every dream we'd held for our first traditional Thanksgiving spread. We could have told the story to our child, except that Rosa had aborted our child, and then she told me to find someone else. That's a little mean. That's a cheap shot, I think. Again, I would have probably edited that out. We'd been apart for nearly 5 years by this time, and I'm pretty sure Vicky had heard enough about Rosa. God knows I had. I continued by assuring Vicky, it doesn't matter what my parents think. If they don't like you, that's their loss. My dad's going to be his hard-nosed self, and he'll probably make his stupid jokes, but Blanche is always very nice. She'll probably have Dad on his best behavior. None of this preparation was necessary. To my surprise and befuddlement, my dad and Blanche loved Vicky as soon as they met her. I guess it shouldn't have surprised me at all. After all, I felt the same way. After they left, Vicky told me how much she loved Blanche. About my dad, she said, "I think he's funny, like a funny old man." "He's not funny," I corrected. I was the only person in my family who had ever successfully written comedy that had appeared on a live stage, and I thought she was equating what I'd done with my dad's little quips and puns. And if I may tangentially just say, yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. There was no changing her mind, of course, and there was no way to forget the way Blanche had said to her, "I'm so glad you've made Ken happy. It's so nice to see him happy again. It's been so long." Blanche was referring, of course, to my divorce and my subsequent attempt at suicide. Even as I write about it now, or read about it now. It all feels so embarrassing. But the alternative to not having committed suicide is far less acceptable and makes it harder to write. I loved Rosa tremendously and believed with all of my heart that I would never love again. Losing her was like losing my heart. It took years to heal again, years of terrible decisions and anguish. But slowly I began to piece myself together and find my way out of the darkness that surrounded me. A few months later, I met Vicky. And after all I had been through, I believed I was ready for her. I was ready to accept Vicky and her love and life. Back in Phoenix, Vicky awoke to find me just about to nod off, as usual. But I checked out beside her, and Vicky drove us the rest of the way to the small home my dad and Blanche shared in Chandler, Arizona, not Bing. Somehow, with Vicky in my life, visiting my dad was no longer the chore it had once been. When the two of us would sit in a room and try, with very little luck, to carry on a conversation. In so many ways, my dad and I could not have been more different. Dad was a sports fan. I was an artist. Dad was opinionated and spoke his mind. I was opinionated, but intimidated, so I kept my mouth shut. As I've mentioned, our political views couldn't have been more different. On top of that, my father was a very religious man. Though he had explored several Christian faiths, he always held whichever one he followed very close to his heart. I, on the other hand, was an atheist, at best a Buddhist. We wanted a place in each other's lives, but the pieces didn't quite seem to fit. Somehow Vicky was that missing piece. She made things so much easier on all of us, so that the strangeness of my relationship with my dad and his with me somehow disappeared, if temporarily. We all went out to dinner to a local fish restaurant. Yes, in the Arizona desert. But then nothing really was local there unless we feasted on cactus and lizard. And wouldn't you just bet my dad would know of such a place if I had asked? Vicky told them all about our wedding plans, and I sat back and watched Vicky go. Vicky has an incredible energy when she's passionate about something, and the passion she felt for our wedding, for us, was a pleasure to see. As we returned home, we did our own talking about the wedding, what we still had to do, what I had to do, what remained in the months between June and September. All those plans progressed, and as the wedding became more certain, more real, I'm ashamed to say I wasn't the best a groom could be. Somehow, Vicky understood this, though. She knew all about what Rosa had taken from me and how terrified I was of feeling that pain again. And despite Vicky's daily reassurances in her actions, in her attitude, and yes, even telling me, I was certain I would. Somewhere, hidden deep down in the scar tissue Rosa had left behind, I just knew any marriage I entered into would end in divorce. Horrible, painful divorce. And perhaps that's another reason why Vicky was being so understanding, because my ugly divorce was rearing its equally repulsive head once again. And I can't lie to you, it was my fault. You see, and this is far more detail than I would ever give right now, but here we go anyway. After Rosa and I split up, I went through some rather extreme lengths to get her back. We had reached a settlement on our house, which was incredibly fair to Rosa, I took a few thousand and walked away, leaving her with the house. Later, when I was desperate to get her back, Rosa played upon my desperation. Rosa told me about some improvements she wanted done to the house that she couldn't afford. She told me about how nice the house would be if we ever got together. She also said, and here's the sneaky part, that if we did end up together, I would enjoy the house so she wouldn't need to pay me back. Total cost to me, $10,000. And so I wrote Rosa a couple checks totaling $10,000 and luxuriated in the fantasy of finally getting my wife and my life back. But there was a catch. Rosa was already pregnant with another man's child. She claimed to be desperately in love with him. And if this all wasn't soap opera enough, he was a homosexual. Somewhere in the midst of all that craziness, I somehow possessed enough common sense to add one caveat. If Rosa and I did not end up back together in 1 year, she would pay me back in full. She agreed. And that was 2003. 2 years later, not only had she not paid me back, but we had not reconciled, which I suppose is obvious. And she refused to even entertain the thought of paying me back. I considered myself a chump and was ready to walk away. But Vicky had other ideas. She told me just how bad she felt to see me played for a fool. Vicky, being in the legal field, knew plenty of lawyers, and while she wasn't going to push me into taking Rosa to court, she assured me she knew plenty of lawyers who would do it for free. All I had to do was give the word. One night, I sat out on my patio, a glass of scotch in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and thought about everything Rosa had taken from me. She had taken from me the life she had promised in her wedding vows. Our marriage ended when she tired of it and told me to find someone else. Desperately lonely, I did. And the consequences tore me up with guilt. It took me years to realize how she had pushed me into it. And just as an aside, I think this is all rather mean-spirited. One thing you realize in divorce is it's nobody's fault. You're on a path, and it's just the way things worked out. She had taken from me the child we conceived. After she decided to get an abortion, she told all her friends and family that I had forced her to do it, which is true. She had taken from me the future we had planned and the love I thought we had shared. And now it was happening again. Here I was, allowing her to not only take the money, but also to take my guts. And on top of it all, I was blaming myself. Why wasn't I standing up to her? What did I owe her anyway? She had taken everything else. Shouldn't I at least stand up for myself this one time? So, not only was our summer filled with wedding plans, but Vicky and I also spent the summer readying for court. My attorney, Julie, started out by forwarding Rosa a very generous offer. Rosa wouldn't have to pay me back. All she would have to do was sign a lien on the house so that when she finally sold or refinanced it, the $10,000 she owed would be taken out of the proceeds. But Rosa wouldn't agree to that. Again, this is far more detailed than you need. She didn't want me to have the money. She could care less about my self-respect. She lawyered up, and we filed for a trial date. We learned that her strategy would not be based on fact. This is a very Trumpian thing. In contrast, my plan was to use our agreement and emails in which she assured me she would respect our agreement. Rather, we learned that Rosa would resort to character assassination, crucifying any last shred of respect I thought she might have, in the hopes that she would come out looking favorably before the judge. I appeared in court on August 18th, 2005, and waited for Rosa to appear. And waited and waited. My attorney explained to me that we would have to move the trial date to October 13th, 2005. Not only was that 3 days before my birthday, it was also after my wedding date. I had insisted on just one thing when we went down this road. I had wanted all of this ugliness wrapped up before the wedding, so that none of it tarnished the day I married Vicky. But that, sadly, was not to be. Nothing would wait for me. I couldn't get the court case with my ex-wife resolved. I couldn't get my feelings about how horribly I had handled my first marriage resolved. I had just over a month to go until my wedding day. And worse still, my bachelor party was only 2 days away. The bachelor party had been important to me. The night before my first marriage, my bachelor party had consisted of me and my best man drinking Mickey's Big Mouth beer, something no one should ever do under any circumstances. This time, we would do things right. My best friend in 2005 was Tim, a tall, handsome, olive-skinned homosexual man who I loved more than my own brothers. I always would. About a year later, when his alcoholism had grown so out of control that I had to take this is a poorly written sentence. About a year later, when his alcoholism had grown so out of control that I had to take myself out of his life, I would still love him just as much. Vicky and I knew about Tim's love of the drink before the wedding, but we convinced ourselves that he could control himself. And in fact, we had seen that when Tim needed to, he could lock it down. Tim was the obvious choice for my best man, even if he couldn't understand it. Before he agreed, we had to have a few discussions about his being homosexual. Now, this is a really poorly phrased sentence. It wasn't about his being homosexual. It was about him not thinking he fit because he was homosexual. So I had to reassure him. And that sentence reflects none of that. These consisted of Tim asking, "Are you sure you want me to be your best man?" And me answering, "Yes, Tim." I assured him that the responsibility wouldn't be that great and I'd help him get through. He'd have 2 groomsmen to help him out as well. These 2 groomsmen consisted of Sean and Jeff. Sean, who you may have heard of, was all but my best friend at the time. If not for Tim, he would have been. I knew Sean's strengths would complement Tim's weaknesses beautifully. I knew he'd keep Tim in line. He was in. My final groomsman, Jeff, was actually Vicky's friend before he was mine. But I chose him because of what happened when he and I met. Jeff and I met on the night when I had proposed to Vicky. The 2 of us sat outside and shared a couple of smokes. And he spoke to me as though there was no question in his mind that I would be part of his life. And Vicky's, because the 2 were practically inseparable forever. That certainty of his, that calm, cool certainty, which I probably could count on one hand from the people that I've known in my life, was just what I always wanted in a friend. He was in. Besides, the fact that Jeff was also a homosexual quieted Tim's uncertainty about my wanting him as my best man. Tim had some strange ideas about marriage, though, I'll tell you that. Tim thought that my marriage to Vicky would spell the end of our friendship. He explained, "Well, you know, you'll want to start a family and have kids, and then you won't have time for your friends. It's perfectly natural, Ken. It happens all the time." "Did it happen when I married Rosa?" I asked him. Tim knew full well that it hadn't. He and I had been friends since high school. "No, but you didn't have kids." "Listen, Tim," I told him on more than one occasion, "you're my best friend. I love you. You're an important part of my life. I would never shut you out of it." I was wrong, of course, but I had no way of knowing it at the time. On August 20th, 2005, my groomsmen threw me my first bachelor party. Mind you, none of us had any idea what to do. We were all nearly in our 40s, either married or getting ready to get married, or lacking in any interest in women anyway. But we pooled our ideas, brainstormed, and I finally just told them what I wanted to do. For me, a bachelor party didn't need to be about naked women or crazy escapades. All I wanted was some time with my friends, a card game, some good scotch, a good old-fashioned smoker. We had much more. The evening began at a local joint called Dave & Buster's for some pool. In attendance were Tim, Sean, Jeff, myself, and Clay. Clay was just another of Vicky's circle, but I wanted him there because I knew I'd become a part of that circle too, by and by, if all went well. Clay was on a pool league. He actually knew how to play. Once word of this got out, nobody wanted to shoot pool with Clay, but I did. Anyway, I told him I had to win. It was my party, after all. And Clay was a good enough sport to let me, a couple of times. Occasionally, Tim, Jeff, and I would duck outside for a cigarette. We were all smokers then. And Tim would check me to see how the night was going. "It's great, Tim. Stop worrying," I told him. "I'm having a great time." After we shot pool for a while, and before Clay could get any of us to play for money, we all left the joint and reconvened at the official party, the Smoker. I was driven to the Embassy, well, it says the Embassy Hotel. It's actually the Embassy Suites Hotel, just a few blocks away from my house. I could literally walk from there. Half a dozen stories up in a large suite, the guys had set up a table and a deck of cards, chips, and eats. Tim had purchased for me a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label Scotch and through a series of poker games that went on hour after hour. I did my level best to polish it off. Tim drank a little, but he had a bottle of flavored vodka, his liquor of choice back then. Clay had brought a 40-ounce can of beer. Jeff and Sean didn't drink. We filled the room with smoke until the smoke detectors went off. After that, it all became a blur. Someone took all of our money, and I think that was Clay. I came away about $5 up, which was nothing. Sean won a bit too, but he knew he had to leave because he had to get back home to Megan, who we all knew was very sick. So there was no giving him a hard time. When the party broke up, I was blackout drunk. So I guess it was a success. One minute we were setting off the smoke alarms with all of our cigarette smoke, and the next, Tim and I were alone. I grabbed a bottle of water from the minibar, realizing that I had done nothing to rehydrate, and I'd probably suffer from a hell of a hangover the next morning, and saw that it was already 2:30 a.m. Tim fell down on one of the twin beds, and he was out. But for some reason, I was wide awake. Of course I was. Leave it to me to be a drunk insomniac. I tried to get Tim to speak, but he was out. The way I should have been if chemistry had anything at all to say about it. Since Tim wasn't going to say anything, I did all of the talking. My words probably shouldn't have surprised me, but they did. I told Tim about how I still loved Rosa, about how I thought about her every day, about how desperately I still wanted her in my life, and most importantly, about how I missed the continuity with the person I thought I loved and who I thought loved me. I had believed Rosa to be decent and good, but her actions leading up to and following our split had shown me otherwise. I was pretty much a jerk too. How could I be sure of what I thought about any person after that? I told Tim about how I loved Vicky so much and how confusing that felt given what I had just told him. And yet, I knew I was a lucky guy to have found someone who was so good to me, and who was just so good, such a warm, decent, funny, and downright good person. I knew I had lucked out, and I promised Tim that I wouldn't forget it. I stood out on the room's balcony, leaning heavily on the railing, something a more sober Ken would never have done because the railing was never meant to hold up a full-grown man, and smoked angrily, angry at myself. What did I think I was doing anyway? I knew Vicky deserved better, but I loved her so much. I couldn't bear the thought of living without her. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up several times in my bed. The final time, someone was knocking on the hotel room door, pounding on it. Tim, chipper and awake, opened it to let in Sean, also wide awake and far too loud. I was painfully hungover. I couldn't move without jostling the broken bones of my shattered skull. The hangover was that bad, but somehow we had breakfast. Tim and I poured ourselves into Sean's car, and he drove us back to my house. When we got there, we saw Vicky cleaning out our patio. She was wearing a t-shirt tied up in front and some cut-off shorts, and she looked sexy in a 1970s porn, sweaty, sexy kind of way. And I still remember seeing her. And yeah, she looked fine. I won't say I forgot my hangover, but I was willing to give that a try just to jump on my wife-to-be. Sometime that day, we put Tim on a train bound for his San Diego home. At night, we laid together in bed and talked about my feelings and the horrible times I'd gone through in the years before. I've talked about these years elsewhere, but I'll tell you what I said to Vicky, which is, I honestly don't know how to make it through. I didn't know how I lived with years of depression and despair. I was just happy they were behind me, and my future was looking so warm and filled with love. The bachelor party had been planned so far from the wedding because Vicky had given me one rule: no partying the night before our wedding. Vicky had seen my skill with a bottle and knew what I looked like the next day. So she told me I could do whatever I wanted to do, but I couldn't do it the night before the wedding. And it was with this in mind that Tim threw me a second bachelor party in San Diego. And to hear about that second bachelor party, I'm going to ask you to turn into part 2 of chapter 4 of The Day We Said Goodbye, a meditation on acceptance, written by myself, Ken LaSalle, available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Come back for part 2 and I'll take this goofy thing off my head. Promise. See ya. And that's it. Thanks for coming around, and I hope you subscribe, click the like button, and connect with me on all that social media business on the screen.